Some memories never leave the room. A dress left between two lovers. A letter no one was meant to read. A single button, undone, and everything changed. Tonight, I'll take you into 3 stories where intimacy lingers longer than love ever dared. But before we begin, tell me in the comments, what time is it where you are? And who are you thinking of right now? If this isn't your first time here, welcome back. And if it is, you're already exactly where you need to be. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe. You won't want to miss what's still hidden beneath the next door. It was raining in Paris that afternoon. Not the kind of wild, desperate rain that flattens umbrellas and washes out streets, but a gentle, steady mist that softened the edges of buildings and made every window glow like a lantern. Rue d'Aubepine was almost silent, except for the clicks of her low-heeled shoes against the wet stone. She stopped outside the atelier, hesitating in front of the worn wooden door, one gloved hand still holding her closed umbrella. Inside, the air was thick with lavender and faint traces of chalk. The kind of place that had not changed with fashion, but waited quietly for time to circle back to it. He looked up as she entered. "Bonjour, madame." She almost corrected him, mademoiselle technically, but she let the word pass. There was something about the way he spoke it, as if he'd already seen something of her life that even she hadn't decided yet. The atelier was small but not cramped. Bolts of fabric leaned in against the walls like silent sentinels. A soft, yellow light hung from the exposed beam above, casting a warm haze that made everything feel slightly out of time. He was younger than she expected, early 30s perhaps, but with the poise of someone who'd worked with hands that had learned from silence. He wore a navy waistcoat over a white shirt, with the sleeves rolled up just past the wrist. She noticed the length of his fingers as he reached for his measuring tape. "Your fiancé chose well," he said simply, unrolling the tape. "This fabric," he gestured to a bolt of off-white silk, "is like moonlight after rain." She smiled politely, but said nothing. The wedding was 3 months away, and the idea of silk brushing her skin as she walked toward a man she had not touched in weeks felt like a story someone else was living. "Shall we begin with the bust and shoulders?" he asked gently. She nodded and slipped off her overcoat. Beneath it, she wore a light blouse with buttons up the back, something she had chosen deliberately for its modesty. But now, standing before him, she felt the weight of each button like a secret. He circled behind her and paused. "May I?" he asked, his hand hovering just above the top button. Her breath caught, then steadied. "Yes," she said. She expected the feel of cool fingers or a sudden touch, but instead, she heard the faint rustle of his breath. The button slipped loose with a softness she hadn't anticipated, and then another, and another, until the blouse parted slightly at the nape and the thin cotton whispered away from her spine. His fingers never touched her skin, but she felt them everywhere. He measured slowly, with reverence more than precision. Each wrap of the tape was careful, around her bust, her waist, down the slope of her hip. She could feel the warmth of him near her, the steadiness of his presence. He didn't speak, and she didn't ask questions. The silence between them was not awkward. It was a silence full of noticing. "I'll need you to raise your arms," he said after a while, stepping back. She complied, and her blouse lifted, revealing a hint of the lace beneath. The moment passed. Or, rather, it didn't. She caught the way he blinked, just once, but it was enough to mark that he had seen it, and more importantly, that he had decided not to comment. When she lowered her arms, their eyes met for the first time. It was not a gaze of longing, it was something deeper. Recognition, as if he had seen in her not just a customer, not just a body to be fitted, but someone else entirely. She exhaled, slowly. "I haven't tried on a dress in a very long time," she said, her voice quieter than she meant it to be. "Then we'll start with a simple silhouette," he said. "Let the body speak before the fabric answers." The phrase startled her, not because it was strange, but because it felt honest. He turned to a nearby form and unpinned a half-draped muslin base. "Step behind the screen," he said. "You can slip this over your underthings. I'll pin from the outside." As she undressed behind the folding panels, she ran her fingers over her thighs, feeling the soft heat in her skin, where his closeness still lingered. She slipped the muslin gown over her body and emerged. He stood waiting, arms crossed, pins between his lips. When he began to drape the fabric against her body, their distance closed again. She could feel the brush of his knuckles near her ribs, the brief press of his palm adjusting the line of her back. The muslin was thin, translucent in the light, and each movement felt like a small act of trust. "There," he said at last, stepping back. She looked at herself in the tall mirror. The muslin clung to her in the right places, but it was more than that. For the first time in a long while, she felt seen, not admired, not inspected, not evaluated, seen. She turned slightly, catching the soft dip of her waist, the suggestion of a shape not built for another's eye, but simply hers. "I think I'll like this dress," she said. He nodded. "I think the dress will like you too." She laughed, genuinely, unexpectedly. The moment broke the spell, but gently, like the soft click of a closing music box. She stepped back behind the screen and dressed slowly, buttoning each loop as if it meant something. When she emerged again, he handed her the appointment card for the next fitting. Their hands brushed briefly. The sensation lingered like the imprint of silk. Outside, the rain had stopped, but she no longer noticed. She caught the way he blinked, just once, but it was enough to mark that he had seen it, and more importantly, that he had decided not to comment. When she lowered her arms, their eyes met for the first time. It was not a gaze of longing, it was something deeper. Recognition, as if he had seen in her not just a customer, not just a body to be fitted, but someone else entirely. She exhaled, slowly. "I haven't tried on a dress in a very long time," she said, her voice quieter than she meant it to be. "Then we'll start with a simple silhouette," he said. Let the body speak before the fabric answers. The phrase startled her, not because it was strange, but because it felt honest. He turned to a nearby form and unpinned a half-draped muslin base. "Step behind the screen," he said. "You can slip this over your underthings. I'll pin from the outside." As she undressed behind the folding panels, she ran her fingers over her thighs, feeling the soft heat in her skin, where his closeness still lingered. She slipped the muslin gown over her body and emerged. He stood waiting, arms crossed, pins between his lips. When he began to drape the fabric against her body, their distance closed again. She could feel the brush of his knuckles near her ribs, the brief press of his palm adjusting the line of her back. The muslin was thin, translucent in the light, and each movement felt like a small act of trust. "There," he said at last, stepping back. She looked at herself in the tall mirror. The muslin clung to her in the right places, but it was more than that. For the first time in a long while, she felt seen, not admired, not inspected, not evaluated, seen. She turned slightly, catching the soft dip of her waist, the suggestion of a shape not built for another's eye, but simply hers. "I think I'll like this dress," she said. He nodded. "I think the dress will like you too." She laughed, genuinely, unexpectedly. The moment broke the spell, but gently, like the soft click of a closing music box. She stepped back behind the screen and dressed slowly, buttoning each loop as if it meant something. When she emerged again, he handed her the appointment card for the next fitting. Their hands brushed briefly. The sensation lingered like the imprint of silk. Outside, the rain had stopped, but she no longer noticed. She laughed softly, but it wasn't amusement. It was recognition, because it was true. She hadn't moved with freedom in years, hadn't been seen without agenda, hadn't worn a dress for herself. She turned to face him fully, and the moment caught. There was no touch, no kiss, no reckless gesture, but something passed between them, charged and clear. A thought neither of them voiced. She stepped back behind the screen slowly, her fingers trailing the silk as she removed it, more tenderly than she had put it on. It felt like undressing something sacred. When she emerged fully dressed, he handed her a new appointment card. This time, their fingers didn't just brush. His thumb lingered over the top of her knuckle. Just once. She looked down at their hands, then up into his eyes. Stillness. And then, "Until next time," she whispered. "Next time," he echoed. She didn't tell anyone she was going. Not her fiancé, not her sister, not even her own reflection as she stepped out of the apartment that afternoon, in a long coat and unassuming heels. It wasn't an act of betrayal, it was an act of preservation. The third fitting, but it felt like something else entirely. When she arrived, he was waiting, this time, not behind his work table, not hidden in the folds of fabric and tape measures, but by the window, looking out. When he turned to her, his expression didn't shift into greeting. It simply held. like he'd been staring into his own thoughts, and now she was in them. "Did you make changes?" she asked, gesturing to the dress form beside them, already fitted in ivory chameaus, but now with a delicate row of mother-of-pearl buttons trailing down the back. He nodded. It asked for them. She stepped behind the screen, undoing her blouse with steady hands. Not slow out of hesitation, slow out of anticipation. She could feel something in the air, like music that hadn't yet begun, but whose first note was humming beneath the silence. When she stepped out, the dress caught the light like skin underwater, soft, luminous, almost fluid. He approached her without words, hands holding a tray of pins, but not yet lifting them. Instead, he asked, "Do you want to be seen, or do you want to disappear?" The question silenced her, not because she didn't have an answer, but because no one had ever asked it before. Not in a way that made her feel like both choices were equally valid. "I want," she began, then paused. "I want to disappear, but only with someone who knows exactly where I am." He didn't respond. He didn't have to. His hands moved, first to the shoulders, adjusting the strap with the tenderness that bordered on reverence, then down to the small of her back, where his knuckles grazed the silk, only just avoiding her skin. The dress clung to her as if it had learned her breath. She turned slightly as he worked, and their bodies passed closer than they had before. He didn't flinch. Neither did she. But something in the air between them changed, grew warmer. He reached to pin the bust line. "Lift your arms," he said gently. She did, and the fabric shifted just enough to suggest rather than reveal. His eyes didn't wander, but hers did. She watched the way his throat moved when he swallowed, the slight tension in his jaw when his hand hovered near her waist, afraid to touch, but unable not to. "You're careful," she said softly. "I have to be," he replied. "What if I don't want you to be?" That silenced them both. The pins in his hand stilled. His eyes met hers, not in the mirror, but directly, unflinching. And in that shared stillness, something broke. Or rather, something opened. He set the tray of pins down, slowly, deliberately. Then he stepped behind her and reached for the row of buttons along her spine. "May I?" She nodded once. Each button came undone like the tick of a clock winding backward. The air brushed her skin in the places his hands didn't touch. Her back arched just slightly, not from need, but from memory, as if she'd been here before in some half-lived dream. When the last button slipped free, the back of the dress parted just enough to reveal the base of her spine. Not indecent, not exposed, but bare enough to feel intimate. His hand hovered just above it. He didn't touch her. He didn't need to. The silence between them was physical now, a pressure in the air, a breath held between two mouths not yet touching. She turned slowly to face him. The dress was half undone. Her hair had slipped slightly from its pin. She looked less like a bride, more like someone on the edge of becoming something else entirely. He said nothing, but his eyes searched hers for the space between decision and regret. She closed that space, not with a kiss, not with a rush, but by stepping forward, so close that the front of the dress brushed his shirt and her breath warmed his collarbone. Still, she didn't touch him. Instead, she said, "I don't know where this ends." He answered, "Then don't end it yet." She stood like that, eyes closed, for what could have been seconds or centuries. Then, with a breath, she stepped back. The spell didn't break. It simply settled. He turned quietly and retrieved a silk robe from the coat rack. "For the next fitting," he said, his voice thick. She took it gently, pressing it to her chest like a memory she hadn't earned yet. And then, like always, she dressed behind the screen, this time slower. Each button now felt like a decision. When she emerged, he didn't hand her an appointment card. This time he simply said, "I'll see you again." And she whispered, "You already do." It was raining on the day of the final fitting. Not a dramatic, cinematic downpour, just the kind of rain that softened the edges of buildings, that made the city look like it had been painted in watercolor. It suited her mood, and oddly, it suited the dress. She didn't carry an umbrella. Letting the rain touch her hair felt honest. Inside the atelier, it was warmer than usual. The lamps were turned low, casting an amber glow over the cutting table and the thread-spattered floor. The scent of steam and starch lingered faintly, mingled with something floral and faint, perhaps her own perfume, forgotten but remembered by the fabric. He was there, waiting as always. But this time, he didn't pretend it was just a fitting. "I added one last detail," he said, his voice a shade lower than usual. "You'll see." She nodded. There was no screen this time. Not because she didn't need it, but because neither of them needed the pretense anymore. She undressed slowly, like she was peeling away not just layers of clothing, but months of restraint. Her blouse slid off her shoulders with barely a whisper, her skirt falling like a sigh to the floor. He looked away at first, out of respect, perhaps. But he didn't move far. He simply turned slightly, as if what he saw when she stepped toward the dress form would be less dangerous than what he might imagine if she stayed hidden. The dress hung on a wooden hanger, waiting, and when she lifted it over her body, he stepped forward wordlessly to help her. It was heavier than before, not with weight, but with meaning. He fastened each button with a careful reverence, each one echoing like a heartbeat. When he reached the last, just below the nape of her neck, he paused. "I added a stitch here," he said, brushing her skin with the back of his fingers. "Invisible to most, but strong enough to hold everything together." Her breath caught. She didn't ask what everything meant. She knew. He turned her gently toward the mirror. The dress shimmered in the lamplight. Elegant, yes, but no longer ceremonial, no longer bridal. It was something else entirely, something intimate, almost private. "You look like a woman who's just come from something," he murmured. "Or going toward it," she whispered back. Their eyes met in the mirror, no longer separated by it. And then it happened. Not a kiss, but something quieter. She stepped closer. Her hand reached up to his chest. She didn't touch his skin. She touched the line of his shirt, right over his heart, and rested it there. He didn't move. And then, with infinite slowness, he brought his hand to the curve of her waist. Not possessive, not hesitant, just present. For a moment, they stood like that. Two people wrapped in something older than desire, something that felt like understanding, like recognition. Her eyes closed, and when she opened them again, there were tears, not of sadness, but of inevitability. "I'm marrying him next month," she said, voice barely audible. "I know. But this, whatever this is, it's mine." He didn't nod. He didn't agree. He just stepped back half a pace and said, "It always was." She exhaled. And with that, the moment passed. Not broken, just gently folded away, like fine fabric. She turned toward the door, and for the first time, he walked her there. At the threshold, she turned back one last time, and he said, "There's a thread in that dress, tucked near your hemline. If ever you need to find your way back here, just pull it." She smiled through the mist gathering in her eyes. "I won't pull it, but you'll know it's there." She nodded, and then, quietly, she left. The door closed softly behind her, the scent of silk and memory still clinging to the air. And in the fading silence, he whispered to no one, that was the final stitch. It was the kind of silence that had weight, not the kind born of absence, but of presence too dense to name, the kind that filled old rooms with things left unsaid, like smoke or longing. The lamp in the corner glowed amber against the thick velvet curtains. Outside, Lake Geneva mirrored a bruised sky, clouds slow drifting like ships made of memory. The old hotel smelled of aged wood, orange blossom soap, and books too long left unopened. The kind of place where stories didn't begin, but lingered. She hadn't expected to see him, not here, not tonight, not after 10 years. But then again, fate never respected timelines. It unfolded in peculiar patterns, like creased linen, tugged only slightly, and everything unraveled. She was standing at the lobby's writing desk, penning a postcard she knew she'd never send, when his voice cut through the air behind her. "You still start with the word dearest, even when no one's reading." Her hand froze mid-sentence. Her body too. She didn't turn at once. She needed the moment. To gather, to breathe, to pretend she hadn't once memorized the texture of his voice, the gravel at the edges, the softness just beneath. When she did turn, he was there, thinner, slightly more weathered around the eyes, but still unmistakably him. The same crooked smile, the same way of standing, like he hadn't quite decided whether to stay or leave. "Hello, August," she said. He gave a short nod. "Nora." And there it was. All the years collapsed between them like a deck of forgotten photographs. They walked, not to reconnect, but because neither of them had the courage to say goodbye again. The hotel bar was nearly empty. A piano played low from an old speaker, and the clink of glass was the only conversation happening around them. They sat by the window. She drank white wine, dry and cold. He ordered whiskey, neat. "You look the same," he said, eyes flicking over her like a sketch artist, trying not to get caught in the line work. She raised an eyebrow. "That's a polite lie." He smiled. "Then let me revise. You look like someone who's remembered how to forget." The words sat between them a moment longer than they should have. "You disappeared, August." "I know." No letter, no call, not even a shadow. "I know." Her fingers tapped the rim of her glass. "I thought," she whispered, "you might have died." He looked away, jaw tightening, and then softly, almost like he was handing her something fragile, "I did, in a way, but not the part that missed you." There it was again, that silence, heavy, thick with unfastened things. He sipped his whiskey and looked out toward the lake. The moon was rising now, full and butter-colored. "Are you here for the conference?" he asked. "I'm presenting tomorrow." "Still a historian?" She nodded. "Still trying to make sense of the past?" He laughed quietly. "Some things haven't changed." They didn't speak for a while, not because there was nothing to say, but because the air between them already said too much. Eventually he turned back to her, eyes softer now, tired in a way that felt honest. "I'm staying upstairs," he said. "Room 3114. She felt the number settle on her skin like heat. "I'm not asking for anything." "I know. But if you want to talk, really talk." She drained the last of her wine and nodded. The room was dim and warm. The air still carried the scent of cedar and something faintly masculine, leather perhaps, or worn cotton. His camera bag sat near the foot of the bed, open but untouched. She didn't sit, just stood near the wall, where a framed map of the lake hung slightly crooked. "You were gone so long," she said. "I couldn't stay." "Couldn't or wouldn't? Does it matter?" It did, back then. He took a slow step toward her, not imposing, just enough to share breath. "I left because loving you made me afraid of myself." She blinked. "That makes no sense." "It does," he said. "If you know what it's like to finally find something beautiful and realize you don't know how to keep it without breaking it." She turned her face away. "You don't get to be poetic about it now." I'm not trying to be poetic. I'm trying to be honest. Her voice dropped, low and sharp. I don't need honesty. I needed presence. He was quiet again, the kind of quiet that came not from guilt, but from memory. And then, may I, he gestured faintly, show you something? She hesitated, but nodded. He opened the drawer beside the bed and pulled out a worn envelope. Inside, a photograph. It was of her, not posed, not aware. She was sitting in a chair by the window, in a cafe in Lisbon, reading a book. Her hair tucked behind one ear, a strand falling over her cheek. She gasped. I took this 3 months after I left. You followed me? Just once. She stared at the photo like it was a mirror she didn't know existed. Why? Because I missed the sound of your page turning more than I missed my own name. A pause, and then a whisper. I brought this every time I changed cities. You've lived in every drawer I've had for 10 years. Outside, the rain intensified, pattering against the window like a confession. She turned to face him again. There was space between them, but it was shrinking. He didn't reach for her. He didn't have to. She stepped closer, not for closure, not for revenge, not even for nostalgia, but for something else, something quieter, something that trembled behind her ribs, something that had waited long enough. Her fingers moved first, not to touch his chest or his hands, but to reach for the top button of his shirt and stop just above it. He looked at her. May I? She asked. His voice broke like a sigh. Yes. But she didn't unbutton anything. Not yet. She simply rested her palm there, right over the past, and let the moment hold. The room didn't move. It breathed. Around them, the hush grew thicker, more patient, like it understood that some silences must stretch before they can release. Nora's hand still rested on his chest, her palm barely touching fabric. Not for balance, not for affection, but as if to test whether he was still real beneath memory's varnish. And he didn't move, didn't break the moment by rushing it. He let it hang between them, like the first bar of a song not yet sung. It's strange, she murmured finally, how even after all this time, I still remember where every freckle on your skin is. August's throat shifted with a swallow. That's because they weren't just on my skin. Her eyes lifted. They were on your memory, he said, voice lower now. Like your laughter is still stitched into the inside of my shirts, even the ones I don't wear anymore. She almost laughed, but it got caught in her breath. The past had returned not like a storm, but like the scent of something forgotten, something still alive beneath the dust. He stepped closer, not forward, just deeper, as though he were entering a space carved from the years they hadn't touched. I should have written, he said. Yes, she replied. No bitterness, just truth. I didn't know how to say goodbye. Then maybe you should have said I'm afraid instead. He nodded, a slow, wounded thing. I was afraid of becoming small in your life, of being the man who distracted you from becoming who you were meant to be. Her jaw clenched slightly. You don't get to decide what I was meant to be, she said. That was never your burden. Silence again. But this time, it didn't ache. She turned, walked slowly to the window. Rain still painted the glass, tiny rivulets running like veins of light across the pane. Did you love me then? She asked. More than I knew how to handle. And now? He hesitated, but not out of doubt. Yes, he said. She turned, and something about the angle of the lamplight, the way her shadow fell across the wooden floor, made the room feel like a stage. Not performative, but intimate. Two characters finally finding the scene they were never allowed to play. Nora stepped back to him. This time, her fingers moved with purpose. The first button. A soft click as the thread gave way. She paused. Not because she was uncertain, but because this wasn't about speed. It was about remembering how to feel without breaking. He let his breath out in a slow, reverent sigh. Tell me something I never knew, she whispered. He thought, and then, the night I left Paris, I stayed outside your apartment for 2 hours. I watched the light in your study turn off, and I said your name out loud into the air. I hoped the city would keep it for me. Another button, another truth. She kept going, each small release of fabric like the letting go of a memory, long folded into silence. Your turn, he said. She paused at the third button. When I met Daniel, she said, the man I almost married, I tried to teach him the way you held me, but it never felt like a language he could speak. August inhaled slowly, his hands still at his sides, trembling only slightly. You were engaged? For 8 months. Why didn't it work? She glanced up. Because he never touched the version of me that still existed in your arms. He closed his eyes. When he opened them, her fingers were at the last button. The space between them had grown hotter, not from lust, but from weight. The cumulative gravity of everything they'd carried separately. She let the shirt hang open, didn't push it off, didn't reach beneath. It wasn't about skin. Not yet. It was about exposure of a different kind. I still think about Venice, he whispered. She smiled softly. The room above the bookstore. You wore a red scarf and nothing else. And you said I looked like a secret poem. You were, he said. And for a beat, they stood there. Two people with open wounds disguised as nostalgia. Then she stepped back, not to leave, but to see him better. You stayed, she said. You didn't run this time. I didn't want to. She nodded. Good. Then, because I'm going to ask you something now. And I need you to say yes, only if you mean it. He looked at her, eyes wide, breath uneven, chest half bare. "Will you let me remember you?" she said, "the way I always wanted to?" He didn't hesitate. "Yes." She moved toward him again, and this time he touched her, just the edge of her wrist, as if to anchor her there, in the room, in the now. There was no rush, no hunger, only gravity. They moved to the bed, not like lovers desperate for release, but like two artists returning to a half-finished painting, knowing exactly what color had been missing. The rain outside softened, the wind quieted, time at last paused, and in that sacred stillness, every button they had ever left closed between them, both real and imagined, came undone. The room was still, not silent, just listening. Somewhere in the distance, the lake made its own kind of hush, brushing gently against the shore as if not to intrude. The air had shifted, warmer now, not because of the radiator or the thick walls, but because of what lingered in the space between two people rediscovering the language of touch. Nora sat at the edge of the bed, her back to him. August stood behind her, shirt still open, chest rising and falling in a careful rhythm. His fingers hovered just above the nape of her neck, not yet touching, almost reverent. He spoke first. "I never stopped wondering how your skin would feel after so many seasons." She smiled, eyes down. "Less certain, more real," she said. "Like time made me into parchment." He finally touched her, just one fingertip, tracing along the bare slope where her dress had slid off the shoulder. It was not a sexual gesture. It was the beginning of an answer. "I like parchment," he whispered. "It carries history better than silk." She turned, slow, her dress whispering as it gathered at her waist. She didn't stop it. What she wore underneath wasn't designed to seduce. No lace, no performance, just simplicity. But it was the honesty of it that made his breath catch. She didn't hide herself, not the faint stretch at her sides from laughing too hard at life, not the pale scar near her hip she got on a trip neither of them had taken together, not the curve that had softened with age and warmth and wine and solitude. He looked at her the way one looks at a coastline remembered from dreams, like something vast and familiar and holy. She reached for his hand, not to pull, not to lead, just to hold. "Tell me a memory," she said, "that still lives in your body." He swallowed. "Vienna," he said. "In winter, you fell asleep on my chest in that pensione with the broken radiator. Your cheek left a mark on my skin that stayed until morning. I didn't move all night, just to keep it there." Her lips parted slightly, the breath between them deepening. "And you?" he asked. She thought for a moment. "The orchard, in Florence, you kissed my shoulder just once in the middle of a sentence. I don't remember what I was saying, but I remember the exact spot where your lips pressed. It never quite went cold again." He moved closer. "Kiss that same shoulder now, right where memory had left its echo. It wasn't about recreating the past. It was about laying it gently over the present, like a quilt, so they could both finally rest inside it. Later, they lay beside one another, not tangled, just touching. His hand along her thigh, her fingers in his hair. They weren't trying to ignite. They were trying to remember how warmth worked. "Is this forgiveness?" she asked softly. He answered with his breath against her collarbone. "It's more tender than that," he said. "It's what comes after." She turned to face him. "Regret?" "No. Regret is loud," he said. "This is quieter. This is something like knowing we would have found each other again, even if it took another decade." She smiled, not with her lips, with her whole body. They kissed again, not the kiss of youth, not the kind that asks for promise or pleasure, but the kind that says, "I still know your language. I still want to speak it." And then, without spectacle, without permission, without fear, they moved together, not quickly, not urgently, but like ink over parchment, slow, intentional, absorbed. There was a moment, just after her breath hitched and his hand cupped the small of her back, when the world felt perfectly silent, not because it was empty, but because it was full of them, of everything unsaid that now lived in skin and pulse and the stretch of time uncoiling like ribbon. When it was over, they didn't speak. They just stayed. Two forms softened by candlelight. The window cracked open, letting the scent of rain-washed leaves drift in. She lay with her back against him, and he traced the line from her neck down to her waist, as if memorizing it all over again. Eventually, she whispered, "If I fall asleep now, will you still be here in the morning?" His voice was raspy with quiet. "I will be here," he said, "in every way I wasn't before." And with that, she let go. Not just of the night, not just of the decade of hurt, but of the tightness she'd been carrying beneath her ribs for years, like a letter she never dared to open. Morning arrived like a whispered truth. No fanfare, no sun slicing dramatically through the curtains, just the pale hush of dawn light brushing gently against the walls. Nora stirred before she opened her eyes, her body already aware of warmth, real, living warmth beside her. For a moment, she didn't move. She just listened. There was breath, not her own, steady, grounded, familiar. When she opened her eyes, she saw him, still there. August had shifted onto his back, one arm behind his head, the other resting where her hip had been. His chest rose and fell in a rhythm she used to know better than her own. Now, it was returning to her like the chorus of a long-lost song. Nora sat up slowly, pulling the blanket with her. Not to hide. There was nothing left to hide, but simply to pause, to take in the room, the way the soft light made everything look older, but kinder. the discarded clothes, the open window, the faint scent of lavender and old wood, and him. His eyes blinked open. "You stayed," she said softly, as if checking whether the night had been real. "I promised I would," he replied. They looked at each other, not with heat or urgency, but with a quiet sort of awe, like two people witnessing the aftermath of something sacred. Downstairs, the cafe owner had not yet begun setting chairs outside. The world hadn't quite woken up. It belonged, for a brief and precious hour, to those who had dared to dream again in the middle of the night. They dressed slowly. He wore a fresh shirt from his suitcase, this one not yet wrinkled by memory. She wrapped herself in a cardigan that still smelled of old books. They didn't speak much, but the silence between them had changed its weight. It no longer pressed, it held. In the kitchen, she brewed coffee the way he used to like it, too strong, slightly bitter, no sugar. She handed it to him in a chipped porcelain cup from her mother's collection. "You still drink it black," she said. "I still want it sweet, but I can never make it taste like you did." She laughed softly. It wasn't a flirt, it was a thread. They sipped their coffee by the window. She didn't ask what came next. He didn't offer promises dressed as plans. But something in her chest softened when he reached across the table and gently took her wrist. "Can I show you something?" he asked. She nodded. From his coat pocket, he pulled a small envelope, folded once and sealed. He handed it to her without a word. She opened it slowly. Inside was a letter, written in ink that had slightly faded. On the paper she used to stock at her first print studio. Dated 7 years ago, she read. Her breath grew shallower with each line. "Nora, I meant to leave Paris. I didn't mean to leave you. That night, when we argued about nothing and everything, I thought I was protecting you from me. I thought love was supposed to look neater than ours did. But now I know. Some loves are messy because they're honest, and some goodbyes aren't really endings. I've kept this letter all this time, trying to decide whether you should know what I never said. But the truth is, it's not for you anymore. It's for me. To remember that I once knew a woman whose laugh could stop a storm, and whose absence taught me how loud silence can be. She looked up, her throat burned. You never sent it? I didn't think I deserved to. And now, he smiled, eyes full of ache and apology and something deeper. Now, I want you to know what I couldn't say then. She folded the letter, slowly, with 2 hands. Her fingers lingered at the crease. You always did write best when you weren't trying to impress anyone, she said. They spent the morning in fragments, not building plans, not fantasizing futures, but doing the small things people do when they're learning to breathe again in each other's presence. They went to the bookstore down the street. They stood by the canal and let their hands touch but not hold. They laughed about how her dog, now gone, used to growl at his cologne. When the sky turned silver with approaching rain, they returned. He packed slowly. She watched from the doorway of her study, one shoulder pressed against the frame. "You're leaving," she said, not a question. He nodded. "I have to catch the train." "I know." He zipped the suitcase, looked at her. "I want to see you again." She didn't look away. "I want that too." They didn't say "we'll talk soon" or "I'll call you." They had both outgrown promises made for comfort's sake. Instead, he walked toward her, stopped just shy of touch, and looked at her like the last page of a book he didn't want to close. "I left the last button," he said. She frowned, not understanding. He stepped closer, reached gently for her blouse, still slightly unbuttoned from the earlier morning, and fastened the topmost button with care. She felt it. Not the pressure of his fingers, but the meaning in the gesture. "I want to come back and undo it properly," he said. And then he kissed her, not a kiss to erase what had passed, but a kiss to remember it. That evening, long after he was gone, Nora stood by her mirror, the top button still done. She didn't undo it. Not yet. Instead, she went to her drawer, took out a piece of stationery, the kind she hadn't used in years. She began to write. "August, I kept your letter, and now I'll give you one in return. Come back when you're ready. I'll be here, wearing the memory you left fastened." She smiled, not a smile of triumph, but of softness, of someone who knows not all stories end. Some are simply paused until the next button is undone. It started with the sound of paper, not the crisp flick of a newspaper, nor the crumple of a receipt tossed into a bin, but the soft, deliberate slide of an envelope slipping beneath an old wooden door. At first, I thought it was junk mail. Then again, no one sends junk to room 4C. No one knows anyone lives here at all, except the landlord and the cat that sleeps outside my window every morning at 6. But that first letter, it didn't look like junk. It was ivory, real paper, thicker than it needed to be, sealed with red wax. Not the ornate kind, just a thumb-pressed circle with no symbol. It smelled faintly of lavender, or old books, or a drawer that hadn't been opened since the war. I didn't open it right away. Something about it felt too intentional, like opening it too quickly would be impolite, or worse, eager. Instead, I placed it on the side table, next to the chipped mug I used for tea and paint water. The room was quiet, as always. The radiator groaned in its sleep. The air held still like it was listening. Hours passed. I read. I painted. I ignored it. But it pulsed. Not literally, of course, but like a thought you try not to think. By midnight, I gave in. I sat at the edge of my bed, turned on the soft lamp with the crooked shade, and ran a finger beneath the flap. The handwriting was beautiful, slightly slanted. The ink just faded enough to suggest age or caution. And the words? I hear you reading at night, the way your voice drops when you think no one's listening. I don't know the book, but I know the timbre of your wanting. I wonder if you know mine. That was it. No name, no explanation. Just a sentence wrapped in silence and something that felt like breath on my neck. I didn't sleep that night. The next day, I watched the hallway like a child waiting for Santa. Footsteps, coats, the smell of someone's dinner. No sign. Room 4B was empty, had been since February. Room 4A, a retired piano teacher with a limp and 2 parakeets. Room 4D belonged to a man who wore too much cologne and never made eye contact. None of them had handwriting like that. None of them smelled like lavender and ink. The next letter came 2 nights later. Same envelope, same wax, same feeling of being watched, but not in a way that made my skin crawl, in a way that made it tighten. This one said, "You talk in your sleep. Last night you said someone's name. It wasn't mine, but I wished it was." And beneath that, almost like a dare, "Do you remember touching her this way too?" I read that one 3 times, not because I didn't understand it, but because I did. Some part of me, some buried part I hadn't fed in years, awoke. Days passed. The letters kept coming, each one more intimate, not in detail, but in atmosphere. She never described her body, never asked about mine. She asked about memories, about what my hands remembered, what my breath sounded like against a shoulder I no longer kissed, what it meant when a touch lingered after the lover had left. She made me remember myself in ways no one else had. And somehow, she knew things. That I left the light on until exactly 2:17 a.m. That I drank red wine only from the blue glass. That my left hand trembled slightly when I painted fine lines. Each letter was a portrait of me in shadows and scent. Until one night, her letter was different. No paper, just a silk ribbon, dark green, tucked beneath the door. With it, a small card. "You once said you liked how silk feels when it falls. I wonder, would you like how it feels if it slid down my spine?" My breath caught. I was alone. Or I was supposed to be. But in that moment, I felt as if someone was sitting beside me, breathing with me. By the 5th letter, I wasn't waiting to find it. I was hoping. Like a ritual, I'd return home from my studio, make tea, and check the floor beside the door. Always, like a secret admirer with the world's most delicate timing, she delivered. This one. "You don't know me, but you've touched me in the way only words can. I've heard you mourn someone. I've heard the way you stop breathing when your fingers pause on the page. What if I offered you a new ending?" There was no signature, but the letter smelled faintly of skin warmed by bath water. That night, I left my door unlocked. I didn't know what I was inviting. I only knew I didn't want it to end with paper. The door was left unlocked. That much I can admit. But whether I truly expected her to come in or simply fantasized that she might is a matter my mind has since blurred with 100 restless dreams. I stayed up that night, half clothed, lying on the couch with a book I pretended to read. Every sound in the hallway became a possible footfall. Every shadow beneath the door was hers. Every breath I took felt like it might be shared. But no one came. Not at midnight, not at 2 a.m., not even by the time the pale blue light of dawn began to unroll across my ceiling. Only silence and a chill that wrapped itself around my ribs like a regret. I closed the door that morning with more care than shame. I made coffee that tasted like distance. I painted with hands that now trembled more than usual. The next letter was tucked beneath my pillow, not beneath the door. It was smaller, folded into quarters, the paper warm from having rested against something or someone for hours. No envelope, no wax, just a folded square of whisper-soft parchment, creased carefully, purposefully. Inside, I saw you sleep. You mumble when you dream. My name isn't hers, but I want you to say it. Let me be a memory too. Or, better, let me erase one. I sat on the edge of the bed, the letter trembling slightly in my hand. The room was utterly still, but I could feel the ghost of breath on the back of my neck. Had she really? My gaze darted to the door, still locked, to the window, closed but the curtain slightly parted, to the mirror across the room where my reflection sat, stunned as though watched. I didn't sleep that night either, but not from nerves, from need. By the following evening, something inside me had shifted. A thread had been pulled, and the weave of my solitude was beginning to fray. I set the table for two, not because I thought she would come, but because I wanted her to know that she could. The next letter was waiting on the kitchen counter, folded neatly beside my favorite mug, as if she'd lived here all along. You shaved today, I noticed. I imagine your skin, smooth now, waiting for the graze of something not quite gentle. I wonder how long you'll make me wait before you ask what I taste like. I exhaled slowly. My shirt collar felt tighter than usual, and my thoughts, unsteady, unclean in the most delicious way. This was no longer a game of curiosity. It had become seduction in slow motion, delivered in fragments of desire and ink. I began to write back. Just one note at first. Short, uncertain. What name do you want me to whisper? And how close would I need to be for you to hear it? I left it on the inside of the door, tucked beneath the floor mat, half visible, half hidden. It was gone by morning, and in its place another letter, closer than you've ever been, and slower than you think you can bear. Leave the door open tomorrow night. I'll show you what letters we're never meant to hold. I read it once, then again, then a third time, fingers trembling, heart beating like it hadn't in years. That night, I lit a single candle, dim, flickering. I left the door unlatched and waited. It was near midnight when I heard her, not footsteps, not a knock, but the faintest whisper of the door clicking shut behind someone who knew how to move without sound. I didn't turn. I didn't breathe. My eyes remained fixed on the candle flame as I felt the air shift around me, warmer, more alive. Then, fingers, two of them, light as breath, brushing the nape of my neck, tracing the line of my spine as if writing her name there without ink. I closed my eyes, let the silence stretch, let her fingers linger. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. She moved slowly, deliberately, standing behind me. I could feel the heat of her body, not touching, but close enough to make my skin reach toward her, like it remembered her from a life I hadn't lived yet. Her breath grazed my ear, and then she whispered, "Tell me a truth no one else knows." My lips parted, no rehearsed poetry, no seduction, just, "I haven't been touched in 3 years, but I've imagined you more nights than I'll admit." She exhaled, soft, like satisfaction. I felt fabric fall behind me, her coat, a robe, something loose and silent, and then her hands, sliding across my chest, around my ribs, to rest on my stomach, not claiming, not demanding, anchoring. We stood there for what felt like hours, her against my back, her palms learning the curve of me. No urgency, just contact, warmth, permission. When I finally turned to face her, the candlelight cast her in shadow. I still didn't know her name, still hadn't seen her clearly, but her eyes, soft, searching, held a kind of vulnerability that didn't need explaining. She brought her hand to my collar, slowly undoing one button, then another, then paused. "I'll stop here," she said, "unless you want more." I looked at her, not at her body, at her presence, and whispered, "Don't stop yet." By the time she undid the last button, the candle was a trembling pool of amber. I remember the sound her fingers made, not the friction of skin on fabric, but the intent, as if each button, each motion, was a vow not yet spoken. I didn't shiver from the cold. I shivered from the precision. She didn't rush. She held the weight of the moment like someone who had waited far too long to touch what she had only imagined. When my shirt slipped from my shoulders, her hands didn't roam. They rested, palms flat on my chest, feeling not just heartbeat, but history. "You're warmer than I imagined," she murmured. "I imagined you colder," I said, half smiling. Her laugh, it was soft, uncertain, like she hadn't expected to laugh here, in this moment. That vulnerability made her more vivid than ever. We didn't move to the bed right away. Instead, we stayed standing, face to face, the space between us made of breath and memory. She traced my collarbone, slowly, then the crease of my elbow, then the line where my jaw tightened. She was learning me, not for possession, but for understanding. And I let her, not because I was brave, but because something in the way she touched me made me feel like I belonged to myself again. I let my fingers lift the edge of her sleeve, linen, worn thin at the seams. Her skin was warmer underneath, like it remembered every letter she'd written, with desire folded between the lines. "I've thought about this," I said. She nodded. "Me too." "Since the first letter," she corrected me gently. "Since before that." When we finally lay down, it wasn't in haste. It was in ceremony. She slipped beside me, not into my arms, but onto the edge of the mattress, as if she knew this wasn't about claiming, but arriving. The sheets rustled like old paper. For a while, we didn't even touch, just lay side by side, staring at the ceiling as if some secret were written there in invisible ink. "Why letters?" I asked softly. She turned her head toward me. "Because when you touch someone with words, they feel it in places hands can't reach." I swallowed hard. "You reached me." Her eyes glistened. "And now I want to feel the rest of you." She rolled toward me, our noses nearly brushed. And that was when I saw her fully, for the first time. Not in shadow, not through imagination, but here, real. Her face was not flawless, not airbrushed like the versions I might have conjured in lonely hours. There was a tiny scar just beneath her left eyebrow, a freckle beside her bottom lip, and her eyes, soft, stormy, held a world of unspoken pages. She kissed me, finally, not like in the stories, not like fire, but like a secret being offered. I kissed her back as if I were writing a reply. The kiss deepened, slowly, carefully, her hands on my chest, mine on the small of her back. Each shift of weight, a new sentence, each sigh, a punctuation. She moved against me like a memory trying to become present, like someone who had dreamt of this room, this bed, this exact sheet of time, again and again. And when her body pressed closer, there was no shock, only the recognition of something long awaited, like a letter opened at last. When our clothes fell to the floor, they did so softly. No tearing, no frenzy, just letting go. I kissed her shoulder, her spine, the inside of her wrist. She kissed my sternum, my throat, my temple. And when we finally met, skin to skin, no words left between us, it felt like the final line of a letter that had been writing itself for weeks. There was no crescendo, no choreography, only breath and heat and stillness broken by the kind of closeness that rewrites memory. After, we didn't speak. We didn't need to. Her hand rested on my chest. Mine traced circles against the curve of her hip beneath the linen sheet. Outside, the city remained unchanged. Horns, distant voices, a siren. But inside that room, the world had quieted. She drifted to sleep first, her breath soft against my neck. And in the stillness, I looked around the room. The letters were still there, stacked neatly in the drawer. All the words that had brought her to me. But somehow, I knew they were no longer just hers. They were ours. And tomorrow, I'd write one of my own. She was still asleep when I woke. Or at least, she pretended to be. The morning light bled through the curtains in soft gold lines, sketching shadows across her bare shoulder, the arc of her spine beneath the thin linen sheet. One arm draped loosely over my chest, as if claiming not just my body, but the breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding since the night we met. Her scent lingered on the pillow, parchment and skin and something faintly sweet, like the memory of a fig. I didn't move. I just watched her, wondered if she'd vanish the moment I blinked, wondered if this was still part of the dream she'd written me into. But dreams don't leave bruises in the shape of fingers. They don't leave creases in the sheets, or heat between thighs, or words burned behind ribs. This was real, more real than anything I'd painted in years. When she finally stirred, it wasn't with ceremony. She yawned quietly, blinked slowly, then smiled at me as if she'd been doing this her whole life, like we'd done this 100 times before, like the first kiss had happened a decade ago, and the part where we ruined each other had already passed. "Do you always watch women while they sleep?" she murmured, voice husky. "Only the ones who leave letters under my pillow," I replied. Her smile curled, lazy and satisfied. But then she turned to her back, staring at the ceiling. The silence between us was thick, not awkward, just unfinished. "What now?" I asked. She sat up slowly, the sheet sliding down her bare skin like a confession. "Now," she said, "I go back to my room, and you pretend this was just a night." I blinked. "Is that what you want?" She didn't answer, just looked down at her hands, folding and unfolding them. "I was never supposed to stay," she said finally. "I wanted to touch you without becoming someone you'd need." "Too late for that," I said quietly. She stood, nude and unapologetic, and began gathering her clothes from the floor with practiced efficiency. Her movements were unhurried, but decisive, like someone packing up a story she'd told before. My chest ached with every article she put back on. "You never told me your name," I said. She glanced over her shoulder. "Would it change anything?" "It would make it real," I said. She smirked faintly. "It already was." She walked to the door. No drama, no tears. Just the sharp finality of wood meeting wood as she pulled it open. And then, before stepping out, she looked back. "Check your pillow," she whispered. And then she was gone. I stood there, naked and stunned, in a room that suddenly felt colder. The air still held the scent of her. The sheets still remembered the shape of her. But the only thing she'd left behind was silence, and maybe something more. I turned slowly to the bed, lifted the pillow. There it was, a final letter, smaller than the others, torn at the edge, as if it had once been part of something larger. I opened it, hands trembling. You weren't just the canvas. You were the color. I will remember the sound of your breath, long after I forget the echo of my own. Don't write back. Just paint me the way I made you feel. I sat on the edge of the bed, the letter in my lap, and exhaled the breath I'd held since the door clicked shut. She wasn't coming back. And yet, she never truly left. She was under my skin now, in the silence between brushstrokes, in the softness of my sheets, in the way I would now look at closed doors with a kind of hunger. That afternoon, I set up a new canvas, and for the first time in months, I didn't stare at the blank surface in dread. I let the memory guide my hand, not just the shape of her body, but the ache of her absence, the curve of her voice, the weight of a touch you can no longer trace, but can still feel every time you close your eyes. I painted the letter she never signed. I painted the breath between her words. I painted the way her hips had pressed into mine, as if they'd known the rhythm long before we met. And in that painting, I didn't try to recreate her face. I captured the morning light on skin that once warmed my sheets. When it was done, I titled it, "The Memory That Wrote Itself." Weeks passed. No letters came, but I began to notice subtle things. A single glove left on the stairwell, a hairpin on the cafe counter where I always sat, a smear of ink on my doorframe, too high to be mine. Was she haunting me? Or had she simply written herself into the world I now inhabited? Either way, I started sleeping with the door unlocked again, not in hope, but in reverence. And every now and then, when the night is quiet and I wake to the soft rustle of air, I wonder, was that the creak of a floorboard or a memory slipping under the door again? If you're still here with me, drifting somewhere between memory and dream, thank you. Of the 3 stories you heard tonight, which one lingered with you the longest? And if I may ask, what time is it where you are, and where in the world are you listening from? Leave a comment. I read every one. Until next time, may your dreams be dressed in longing and folded gently into morning.